A lot of time and effort goes into creating videos like this, so if you're enjoying the content, please take a moment to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel.
Why was this photo kept hidden for nearly 80 years? Keep watching to find out. In 1935, the Bennett family lived in a poor neighborhood outside Boston, where 49-year-old Samuel Bennett repaired old pianos in wealthy homes but could never afford one for his own family. His youngest daughter, Rose, loved music more than anything in the world. Every birthday, Samuel wound a tiny wooden music box that played the same gentle melody before bedtime. Rose believed the song could chase every bad dream away. One autumn evening, Samuel was struck by a horse-drawn wagon while returning home from work and never regained consciousness. After the funeral, Rose refused to sleep in her bedroom because the house had become too quiet. One night, her mother placed the old music box into her hands. Inside, hidden beneath the tiny mechanism, was a folded note Samuel had written years before. "If one night this music plays without me, close your eyes. I'll still be singing beside you." Rose wound the little music box every evening for the rest of her childhood. Even after it stopped working decades later, she kept it on her bedside table. As an adult, she became a music teacher and ended every class by softly humming the melody her father had loved. Whenever students asked why she never forgot that tune, she smiled through tears and answered, "Because sometimes the people we lose leave their voice inside the smallest songs." The music box eventually fell silent forever, but its melody continued living inside every child Rose taught. In 1849, Abigail Thompson, a widow with 3 children, trudged westward along the Oregon Trail. Her husband had fallen to fever the previous spring, leaving her with a wagon, a few animals, and a small chest of supplies. Days were long and grueling. Dust choked their lungs, storms turned trails into mud, and rattlesnakes or bandits lurked along the path. Abigail cooked over open fires, tended sick children, and repaired broken wheels with hands raw from toil. Each night, she whispered stories to keep their spirits alive, even when hope seemed distant. By the time they reached the Willamette Valley, Abigail and her children were battered but alive. She claimed a small plot of land, planting crops and building a cabin, teaching her children that survival required courage, ingenuity, and unwavering determination. Her journey was one of countless women whose names never made history books, yet whose grit shaped the frontier. The Antler Ledger, Nome, Alaska, 1955. In a windswept Sami reindeer camp outside Nome, 72-year-old Ante Riston kept an antler ledger carved into driftwood, tracking herd movements, seasonal migrations, and ceremonial offerings. A Sami elder who arrived during the gold rush era, Ante blended Nordic herding traditions with Inupiat knowledge, guiding reindeer across tundra and time. Her grandson stitched muklux from hide scraps, while her sister brewed spruce tea and sang joik songs to calm the herd. The ledger, etched with runes and symbols, became a living map, each mark a step in the dance between land, animal, and ancestry. In 1924, the farm crisis hit Nebraska like a hailstorm in July. Crop prices crashed, but bank debts didn't. When a farmer missed a payment, the bank auctioned his land, his plow, his mules, everything. In Holt County, neighbors watched it happen to the Wilcox family. Good farmers, 7 kids, lost the farm over $400. So when the auctioneer showed up at the next farm, the Lunds, something different happened. Men in overalls filled the yard, silent. When the auctioneer opened bidding on the tractor, a neighbor called out, "1 penny?" Silence, then another, "1 penny!" The bankman laughed. "This is a serious sale." Then old Pete Hanlon, a Civil War vet, stepped forward with his shotgun not raised, just held. "Son," he said, "so are we." For 3 hours, no one bid over a penny. The sheriff wouldn't arrest the whole county. The auctioneer finally gave up. The Lunds bought their farm back for $2.17. They called it the penny auction. It spread across the Midwest. Banks learned you could take a farm, but you couldn't take it without fighting the whole township. A banker wrote to Washington in 1925, "These people have no money, but they have each other, and that's a currency we don't print." The old prairie had once stretched farther than the eye could see. Tall buffalo grass swayed with every breeze, its roots reaching deep into the earth, holding the land together through drought, wind, and time itself. Then came the wheat boom. "Plow every acre," the advertisements promised. "The Great Plains will feed the world." John Whitaker believed them. Everyone did. Together, neighbors tore up millions of acres of native grass. Horse teams pulled steel plows across fields that had never been touched before. Every harvest was bigger than the last. Money flowed. New tractors arrived. Bigger barns replaced old ones. People called it progress. John's father wasn't so sure. One evening, the old man stood at the edge of a freshly plowed field and quietly shook his head. "The grass has been protecting us for thousands of years." John laughed. "It's only grass." His father scooped up a handful of rich black soil. "No, it's our anchor." Years passed. Then the rain stopped. The first dust storm carried away only a little soil. The second carried more. By the third year, entire fields were disappearing. John stood exactly where his father once had. Only now there was no prairie, no wheat, no rich earth. The wind lifted clouds of topsoil high into the sky, carrying away centuries of life in a single afternoon. His father, now frail and gray, walked beside him. Neither spoke for a long time. Finally, John whispered the words he had carried for years. "You were right." The old man looked across the empty land. "It isn't about being right. It's about remembering we belong to the land, not the other way around." When his father died the following winter, John planted something no farmer in the county expected. Not wheat, prairie grass. His neighbors thought he'd lost his mind. But year after year, the roots spread deeper. The wind slowed. The soil stayed. Children who grew up afterward never understood why one field remained green while others disappeared into dust. John never explained. He simply smiled whenever the prairie grass bent gently in the breeze. Some lessons are written in books. Others are written by the land itself, and they are learned only after everything else has been blown away. The Bean Man of Dalhart, Texas Panhandle, 1935. Every dawn, 63-year-old widower Clyde Bean Man McAllister pushed his battered wheelbarrow 2 miles from his failing ranch to the railroad crossing outside Dalhart. In it, one huge pot of pinto beans simmered all night with a single ham hock donated by the butcher, when he had one. By the time the westbound migrant cars crawled past, the beans were thick and fragrant. Clyde ladled them into whatever tin cans, jars, or cupped hands the Okies held out. He fed entire families from the running boards of their trucks while dust devils danced across the dead plains behind them. He never asked for money, only that they pay it forward when the world gets kind again. On the worst days, he served 300 souls before the pot scraped empty. Children still remember the taste 70 years later. In Boone County, West Virginia, the year 1931 arrived like a long winter with no spring. Mines were closed, soup lines stretched around the company store, and children learned the shape of hunger before they learned their letters. One cold morning, a miner named Elias Red Kincaid stood in the bread line staring at the muddy ground beneath his boots. In his coat pocket lay 3 wrinkled apple seeds, saved from a fruit he'd once shared with his daughter. As he waited his turn for a ladle of thin broth, he knelt and pressed those seeds into the frozen earth beside the line. "Maybe one day," he whispered, "something good will grow here." A few women watched him work. The next day, they brought more seeds, peach pits, apple cores, even sprouting potatoes. Soon, men who had nothing else to do began digging rows beside the bread line, turning dead ground into promise. They called it the Bread Line Orchard. Every day, while waiting for food, people planted. They watered the soil with tin cups, protected the saplings with scrap lumber, and prayed over them as if they were children. Through rain, snow, and company raids, the orchard rose like a quiet rebellion against despair. By 1934, the first apple blossoms appeared, pale pink against a world still gray. Children ran between the rows, touching the trees like they were magic. Mothers saved the first fallen apples to bake pies for the entire hollow, the smell drifting through camp like a hymn. The orchard fed the town for decades. Folks said those trees grew sweeter than any others because they were watered with hope, planted by the hungry, and raised by a community that refused to die. In 1851, high in the Bitterroot Mountains of Montana Territory, lived the Whitaker family, reclusive, self-sufficient hunters who hadn't seen a town in years. Jedediah Whitaker, once a fur trapper on the Missouri, had settled deep in the forest with his Nez Perce wife, Owanassa, and their 3 children. Their log cabin stood beside a cold mountain stream, and their lives followed the rhythm of the land. Elk migrations, berry harvests, and snow that could trap them for weeks. Owanassa taught her children medicine from roots and bark. Jed taught them how to fire a rifle, but only when needed. Survival wasn't about violence. It was about reading the land, trusting your instincts, and respecting every life taken. One winter, a stranger collapsed outside their cabin, a wounded surveyor lost from a mapping party. They took him in, mended his wounds, fed him venison and broth, and sent him back come spring. He would later write about them in a Denver paper, calling them the ghost family of the Bitterroots. But the Whitakers didn't care for fame. They lived by an older law, the silence of snowfall, the tracks of a deer, and the stories passed in whispers by the fire. When the Harris family crossed the California state line a year earlier, little Annie clapped her hands. "We made it, Daddy!" Her father forced a smile. After weeks of driving west along Route 66, leaving their Oklahoma farm behind, California looked like the beginning of a new life. They had heard stories of endless orchards, steady work, and fields where crops still grew green. For the first time in years, hope felt real, but hope didn't last long. Every morning before sunrise, hundreds of desperate families gathered outside the ranch gates, hats in hand, waiting for someone to call their names. Sometimes 20 men competed for 5 jobs. Sometimes 100 competed for 10. Most days, no one called for Thomas Harris. When he did find work, the wages barely bought enough beans and bread to keep the children fed. The family lived in a canvas tent beside an irrigation ditch. Rain leaked through the roof. Mosquitoes filled the nights, and the California farmers had a name for newcomers like them: Okies. They didn't mean it kindly. Storekeepers watched them suspiciously. Landlords refused to rent to them. Children laughed at Annie's Oklahoma accent at school. One afternoon she came home crying. "Teacher says I talk funny." Her mother pulled her close. "No, sweetheart. You sound like home." Weeks became months. Their old pickup truck broke down. Their savings disappeared. Thomas stopped talking during supper. Every evening he unfolded the same faded photograph of their farmhouse back in Oklahoma. The roof was crooked, the barn leaned, the fields were already turning to dust. But it was still home. One cold October morning, Annie found her father sitting alone beside the truck. He was staring east. "Are we going somewhere?" she asked. Thomas nodded slowly. "We're going home." "But there's nothing there." He looked at the worn family photograph. "Maybe not. But everything we ever loved is." The journey back felt longer than the one west. The roads were just as dusty, the truck just as overloaded. Only this time, no one spoke about dreams. When they finally reached their farm, the mailbox had fallen over. The windmill no longer turned. Dust covered nearly everything. Annie stepped from the truck and quietly walked toward the porch. She picked up the rusted horseshoe her grandfather had nailed above the door years before. It was still there, waiting. Her father smiled for the first time in months. The farm wasn't alive, but neither was it forgotten. Some families found a future in California. Others found only disappointment. For many, the greatest heartbreak wasn't leaving home. It was discovering that the place they longed for no longer existed, yet somehow it was still the only place they truly belonged. In September 1893, the Cherokee Strip Land Run opened 6 million acres of Oklahoma to settlers. At noon, 100,000 people raced with wagons, horses, and on foot to claim a 160-acre plot. If you got there first, it was yours. The Callahan family had no wagon, no horse, no money. Just 6 children, a handcart, and 10 pounds of salt pork Pa Callahan had saved from his job digging ditches in Kansas. While others raced, the Callahans walked. 22 miles the first day. Ma boiled salt pork in creek water and told the kids to drink the broth. "Keeps the strength in," she said. On day 3, they passed wagons with broken wheels and men fighting over claims. On day 5, their youngest, 4-year-old Ellie, couldn't walk. Pa carried her, Ma pulled the cart. On day 7, they found it. A plot nobody wanted. Sandy, no trees, rattlesnakes. But it was free. They staked their claim with the last of the salt pork nailed the greasy cloth to a stick as a flag. That winter, they ate jackrabbits and prairie root. 3 children died of fever, but the other 3 lived, and so did the farm. In 1943, Ellie Callahan, age 54, testified before Congress about farm aid. She brought the salt pork rag. It was still in her Bible. She said, "You want to know what built Oklahoma? It wasn't speed. It was the ones too poor to run." The family who lived inside an abandoned cliff monorail station. August 1952. Blue Falcon Ridge, West Virginia. A mountaintop coal operation replaced its aging cliff monorail with a modern conveyor system, leaving the old railway abandoned and dozens of maintenance workers unemployed. The company closed its employee housing before the end of summer. Railway electrician Harold Bennett, 47, his wife Dorothy Bennett, 42, and their 3 children packed their belongings into a pickup truck and searched the mountains for shelter. At the edge of a steep gorge stood an abandoned monorail station where ore cars had once carried supplies between the mine and the valley below. Harold repaired the steel-framed control building with reclaimed lumber, while Dorothy converted the former dispatch office into a kitchen using old equipment cabinets as cupboards. The rooftop platform overlooked miles of untouched forest. For nearly 7 months, the station became their home. The children caught the school bus from the nearest highway each morning and spent afternoons collecting blackberries and helping nearby farmers repair fences for extra money. Locals soon began calling them the Monorail Family. In the spring of 1953, Harold accepted a position maintaining electrical systems at a hydroelectric plant. Within a few years, the family purchased a small white farmhouse nestled in the same valley. Dorothy later reflected, "The railway had stopped carrying miners across the mountain, but its lonely station carried our family through the hardest chapter of our lives."